Um, yes, is that okay with everyone?
Yes.
Okay, so we've had a really nice event in the Pava chapter about a couple of weeks ago, and we're very happy to have a follow-up event with Dr. Titze. And I have to tell you, first of all, besides the fact that I really appreciate you being here. It means a lot to me for what we're trying to do locally here in Israel, and besides the fact that you're really one of the world's leading vocal scientists, and you have published so many papers and so many and books and things that have changed how voice and the mechanics is perceived today and how we work with it and what we do with it, and that means so much. And I have to tell a personal story that I met Karen, your daughter, and she's a really brilliant SLP. I met her in LA, and at that time, a few years ago, I was really confused because I wanted to learn more. I wanted to know how the voice worked, and I felt like maybe I should go and study how to be a speech language pathologist because I want to know more. And then Karen said, you should go to Summer Vocology Institute, where my dad is, and that you're going to get all the information you need there. And so that was my mission. And then I started reading your books and I started learning everything. And I took math lessons and physics lessons. I was terrified that I'm going to get there, and with the English, I'm not going to be good enough, which turned out to be one of the most amazing and life-changing experiences. And I've learned so much. And when I met you the first time, I think multiple times ever since, I was always, a little bit stroke a little bit. I felt this important person is here, and I never really felt, I was always really excited. And since then we've had a lot of meetings, and I've learned from you a lot. So I just wanted to say that I really appreciate you, and I really appreciate the fact that you're here, and it means a lot for me personally and also for all of us. So with that introduction, I wanted you, as the father of vocology, to say a few words on what vocology is.
Well, we have two definitions for it. One is simply the study of, or vocalization, study or science of vocalization. And when we say vocalization, we mean not just speech, but we mean everything that humans do when they call, when they sing. But then we also include what we learn from the animal world, because there's so much beautiful vocalization going on in birds and mammals and reptiles that we often don't pay much attention to. And nature has given us so many good examples of alternative ways of making sound. We have our structure that is made for us basically to protect our airway and to allow us to swallow. And so those two main functions, breathing and swallowing, are dominant. And vocalization is built upon what nature has given us for those purposes. If you look at the animal world, there are so many different ways in which sound can be made. We talk a lot about semi-occluded vocal tract techniques, where we nearly close the mouth. And most people would say, well, that's dumb. Why don't you just open the mouth and let the sound out? Well, in nature, a dove, for example, doesn't open its beak when it makes a sound. It radiates from the neck. And the same way with a frog. They blow themselves up and radiate sound from the surfaces. And I'm saying all of this, that vocology is really the study of all forms of vocalization. But clinically, we've also said that it's the science and practice of voice habilitation. And I'm very careful to distinguish habilitation from rehabilitation, because rehabilitation means bringing a voice back to basically what it was when it was healthy. Habilitation means you take it a step further and allow it to do things that were never done before or that are not part of the mainstream of society. So that's the difference of vocology, and it is also a parallel to audiology. You may not know it, but the word audiology is fairly young too. It came after World War II, actually in the early 50s, because we had so many people that lost their hearing in the war, and so there needed to be a more intensive study, and a couple of people invented the word audiology. Before that, it was called something like auricular training or something very, very funny. So there's good history and there's a good reason for having a field of vocology. Before you ask the next question, I just need to say this. I want you to know that I have been in Israel and I love Israel. I've traveled everything from north to south. When my children were very small, I had 2 children at that time. Now I have 4. They're all grown up. But we had our 2 oldest ones. They were basically 3 years and 4 years. And we trekked through all of the terrain that we could to learn all about the Middle East. But it's been a long time now. I need to come back sometime. I know, Aramat, you've invited me to come back and see it all again.
Yes.
And someday I'll do that.
That's wonderful. Yes, I would love to have you here. Definitely. I know Pnina would also join me in the
Yes, you are welcome. More than welcome. We'll give you good time. Yeah.
I bet it would be a good time. Yes,
Yeah.
I can understand that.
Yeah. Good food. Good food.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Wonderful. If anyone we have a bunch of people watching at the, I don't know how you call it, in the background. If anyone wants me to show the video or you want to be a part here, just let me know in the chat and I'll try to keep track of it. Okay, so I wanted to ask you, in the book, your book, Principles of Voice Production, which if you see mine now, it is full of scribbles and stuff. But it's a very important book, and you talk about register changes through muscle activation, vocal fold structure, and many other reasons for why we have those register changes. And I'm reading this, I'm sorry, because I'm a little excited and I wrote the questions ahead of time. So your contribution to the understanding of the mechanism of voice made a huge difference. And I wanted to know, first of all, when did the change of the term vocal cords to vocal folds happen?
You know, Aramat, you're the first one that has formally asked that question. And I always wonder why people don't ask that more often. As far as I know, I was introduced to the vocal fold term back when Minoru Hirano from Japan did his very, very important work on the layered structure of what he called the vocal folds. And he just noticed that so many things are folding in the airway when there's swallowing and when there's coughing and when there's any other kind of airway function that's going on. And he noticed that there were the false folds and there were the epiglottic folds and so forth. And so he called them the vocal folds. And he gave us a good picture of what the cross-section looks like in the coronal plane. Prior to that, and many physicians still call it vocal cords. And to me, vocal cords is every bit as valid as vocal folds because there is a chordal structure, basically fibers that pass from the front to the back. And they are controlled much like the way you control a string or a chord in vibration. And so to answer your question, I think the emphasis on fold began somewhere in the 70s and through the 80s, and all the books changed their nomenclature. But I often now go back the other way, and I point out how important it is to think of the vocal cord as kind of a string that's in vibration.
Yes. All right. And yet it's not only a string, it's so much more, right?
Well, it's multiple strings all in parallel and all tied together with a gel.
Yeah.
I like to think of it more as a fiber gel model, and that's what we call our model that computes sound production with these properties. We call it the fiber gel. The gel is more of a folding concept, and the fiber is more of the chord concept.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Okay, so I wanted to talk about acoustic impedance, that you published a paper about it in 2015. And am I saying it right? Impedance? I never.
Yeah, impedance.
Impedance. Okay, thank you. And in other words, it means the acoustic energy in comparison to just airflow alone, or maybe what people talk about as flow phonation. And I wanted to know if it's true to say that singing should be based more on resonance and less dependent on the airflow.
Yes, in general, I would say what you're saying is true. Airflow that is steady, excuse me, that just goes in one direction, does not produce sound. And there are some people who still believe that if you blow your air out of your mouth in a certain direction, that you can bend the sound up and down and sideways. None of that is possible. The steady flow that goes through your airway is not sound, but the sound rides on top of it. And it is the oscillatory flow, the flow that goes back and forth as it's riding along, that is what creates the sound. And when we talk about impedance, acoustic impedance, what we calculate is the ratio of the acoustic pressure or the oscillatory pressure divided by the flow that results from that. But they both have to be oscillatory. If any one of them is steady, then it's a useless calculation because there is no sound created from that. Yeah. There's probably a follow-up question to this, but impedance is a very important word in science because it can be used in a very general concept as the ratio between a stimulus and a response. And that is so broad that you can think about it. If I talk to you, for example, and you're not listening to me or doing anything that I say, or you're not reacting to it, then I would say we have a high impedance between us. Mm-hmm. Because my stimulus does not produce much response. Mm. Okay? Or zero response. If you have zero response with a stimulus, then you have an infinite impedance. Mm. And that's a good word because then communication is impeded, or transfer of energy is impeded. It is not allowed to happen very easily.
Mm-hmm. And is that what led you to the concept of inertance later?
Yes. The impedance that you calculate has two components, and they can't be combined. They have to always stand as two separate components. One is called resistance, and the other is called reactance. Resistance and reactance. And the reactance is the part that takes acoustic energy and stores it momentarily, and then in a certain time can give it back. Whereas resistance dissipates the energy. So if you have a lot of resistance in any kind of a circuit or any type of a tube, then that's energy lost. But energy going to reactance is energy stored that can be retrieved, can be gotten back.
Yes.
And you ask about inertance. Inertance is just the reactance divided by the frequency. Mm-hmm. Because usually in a system, when you go to high frequencies, the reactance grows very, very rapidly. It gets very, very large. And in order to keep it a little bit more level over frequency, we divide by the frequency, and then we get what is known as inertance. But you can think of inertance as being the property of a tube that carries an acoustic wave, as being the property of being able to store energy for a very short period of time and give it back to the system at a slightly later time.
Yes, and I'll explain that. I'll simplify it just for whoever here is not familiar with the terms. Basically, inertance and using that reactance to our benefit is just good acoustic energy. It's when you think about the resonance and the energy you feel when you're singing. If you know how to use that energy and those sound waves and pressures inside your space here, inside your resonance space, if you know how to use it, your instrument becomes more efficient. And basically, inertance is the good acoustic energy that is there for you, that is helping you out. Am I right? Did I kind of? Okay.
For every pitch that you make, you have a fundamental frequency, and then you have multiple harmonics. Okay, I can do it best with the hand. If my thumb is the fundamental frequency, then I have the second harmonic, the third harmonic, the fourth, fifth, and so on. And all of these harmonics create waves going back and forth in the tube. And if any one of those harmonics is reinforced with acoustic reactance or inertance, then it helps the vocal folds in being more efficient. They vibrate at slightly bigger amplitude, and they also create a more sudden change in the flow when the vocal folds close, and that creates the strong sound or the intensity that we're looking for when we produce sound.
Yes, and I will add that basically that what you talk about when you research the straw and the effects of getting more acoustic energy, then you saw that this straw gives a huge benefit for and the like a large amount of inertance, basically.
Yeah. Well, it turns out that the inertance goes up when there is some part of the vocal tract that's narrow. And so what we do with the straw is we create a positive pressure inside the mouth that goes all the way to the larynx, and it widens everything. It expands the airway. But acoustically, we find that the contrast of sounds, whether you want to have a brilliance or a ring or a twang or any of these qualities, are based on part of the vocal tract being wide and other parts being narrow. That's how we get the best contrast. And that's also how we make vowels, because when we make an ah vowel, we widen it in the front, in the mouth, but we shrink in the back. If we make an e vowel, we do the opposite. We widen in the back and we narrow in the front. So all of the contrasting sounds that we make are based on widening parts of the airway and narrowing other parts. And our muscles have to be clever in being able to do that. But the good thing about the straw is that it will, first of all, widen all the airway. So you have to, you get that automatically. It's a freebie. And then you figure out, now what section in that vocal tract do I want to narrow on top of that? And that gives us then the clarity of all the different sounds.
Yes. Perfect. Which leads me perfectly into the concept of styles, because you have researched different styles of singing and mouth shapes and all that. Would you say that high intensity singing, if we're talking about classical singing where we have no amplification, or contemporary, that maybe musical theater or singers that really need to be loud or high in energy, is the difference between them lies purely on just the resonance shapes, which is the boosts of energy or the formants?
Very much it does. And I have to credit Jo Estel, who I knew when she was beginning her career many, many years ago at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. But she then identified the fact that if you're making a twangy sound, and that's often part of some of the genres that we do, belt or twang, is when the vocal fold, when the epilarynx tube, which is the little tube right above the vocal folds up to the area epiglottic folds, when that and the pharynx together remain fairly narrow, you get the twangy sound, as she called it at the time. Now people might not want to call it twang, they call it something else. But then later Johann Sundberg came along and showed that the classical ring in the voice, or the singer's foreman cluster as it's all called, that is produced not by narrowing the pharynx, but by widening the pharynx. And you keep the epilarynx tube narrow, but you immediately above it widen the tube. And that then creates the strong distinction between a belt or a twang versus a classical ring. Both of them give you more energy. And in the belt sound, you get more energy in the 1,000 hertz range. In the classical, you get more energy in the 3,000 hertz range. So singers figure out, and by the way, that is also where the ear, our auditory system, is the most sensitive. If you ever look at the equal loudness curves that are classic in all the textbooks, you can see that our auditory system is sensitive at about 1,000 hertz, and then again at a 3,000 hertz region. So what singers have learned to do with the contrasting styles is one uses the advantage of the 1,000 hertz region, the other uses the advantage of the 3,000 hertz region.
Yes.
And that's so important, is because perception and receiving of the sound is always tied with the production. We sometimes think, you know, in departments that we live in, when I go to, or I'm retired now from my communication science department, but we always had the audiologist over here, and we had the speech pathologist over here. And they had committee meetings and their classes, and they don't talk anymore. When I learned all of the science, there was always sound reception and perception right next to sound production, because the one is there to enhance the other. They belong together.
Yes, very true. And that's something that you have led a lot of people to see, including me, which is a very valuable message, just to work together and learn more together. And so basically what you're saying, that that singers figured out strategies how to really boost those areas in the voice, in the sound, and they do it with shapes, right? They do it with the vocal tract. So that's why we might see a singer in musical theater open up really wide, or someone in classical just close a little and open in the back. So it's all just a function of the vocal tract and the shape of the resonance, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the trumpet shape is what is used more by contemporary singers now in the belting technique, where the back is narrower and the front is wide, and that's the shape of a trumpet. The classical singer does more the opposite, almost a inverted megaphone shape or inverted trumpet, where they expand in the pharynx, but they keep a modest opening in the mouth. Not closed, obviously, but not as wide as the contemporary singer.
Yeah.
And people always say, which is right and which is wrong. But there is no right and wrong in this. It's what you want to sell to the audience with your sound. And if you get a sound that is beautiful in terms of exciting all the auditory system, and it has all the emotion in it, then you have many, many choices. And that's what's so wonderful about voice production and singing, especially.
Yes, that there are so many options. Yeah, we can make so many sounds. I love it. And so coming from here, we did have, before I move into two questions I have about disorders, Shachar was asking a question as a singing teacher, and he said, what do you think is the minimum anatomical understanding or knowledge that singing teachers should know?
The minimum, well, that's a hard one to answer. We're living today in a world where people want the know why. They're cause and effect people nowadays. We don't accept anymore just tell me how to do it and I'll do it, and I don't ask any questions. And so the more our civilization goes towards wanting to know how things work, the more you as a singing teacher have to know, because you'll get some singers who will not go on until they've got the answer as to why this works or why this doesn't work. There's still a few that say, just tell me what to do and I'll do it, and I don't need to know what's going on. But I was one of those analytic singers, and all the voice teachers I went to, our lessons were sometimes not as effective as they could have been, because they told me something, gave me an exercise, and then my eyes went kind of blurry, and I started thinking about, why am I doing this exercise? And I asked the singing teacher, and oftentimes I did not get an answer other than, well, I know it works, or my teacher told me it works, and therefore we continue to do it. That wasn't good enough for me. Mm-hmm. And that's not good enough for some of your students that you have. So those that are analytic and they can't move on until you've given them the answer, then you're going to have to keep studying so that you can give them the answer.
Yes. And do you think there's also a responsibility in terms of just, you know, understanding the anatomy, understanding the mechanism, so you can really be an efficient teacher, an efficient guide, or is that less?
Well, the singing teacher needs to know a lot about the anatomy and about the physiology and the physics behind the instrument, because they need to give the singer alternate choices. Not everybody is motivated the same way, and not everybody is successful in the same way. And if you just impose one alternative to the individual, you may have chosen the wrong one. For the next person, it may be that you want to push them in the opposite direction because they already have too much of what you gave the first student. Yeah. And so you have to constantly shift your technique in directions where they find the best path. And we're all so different that there's just not one formula that works for everybody. Yeah. And so a singing teacher needs to know more about how the system works than the singer himself, and doesn't have to convey everything, but has to know how to make changes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have to say, from my experience, that for many years I was teaching by a certain methodology or a certain technique. And once I went further into the science and learned more and opened up to other methods, I think, first of all, as a teacher, I grew. I had more options to give my students, but also as a person, to know that the more I learn, the less I know, because it's really endless. and I think it's really, this is what I love about learning the science, that, as you said, there is no right or wrong. You just need to find a way in. You need to find a way that works. And the more you learn, the more ways you know, and the better you can, the more you have to offer your students, basically. So I very much just wanted to add to that.
Right.
And so I'll move into the disorders questions that we had. When it comes to voice disorders, more specifically, maybe a pressed phonation or a breathy voice, which is considered to be less efficient. So when I'm saying that, to anyone who doesn't know, a pressed voice would be something that's really someone who's pressing on their voice, pushing too much muscle tension, and a breathy voice would be something that's really, there is not enough of the muscle and too much airflow. So what have you noticed to be the physics of the common flaw that when people are not using their instrument efficiently?
Well, as far as pressing and breathiness is concerned, this work, Kitty Verolini and I worked on that back in the late 70s and early 80s, and we found that the best position for the vocal processes is if they're not quite touching, almost touching, but not completely. And now we're also finding that when they don't quite touch, and then you bring in the bottom part of the vocal folds and adduct those so that you get more in a square position, as opposed to this kind of a position where the bottom is apart and the top is very squeezed. That is not a very good position. And so you need a moderate amount of adduction, but not over adduction of the vocal processes. And so therefore, we practice actually what we call mixed registration or mixed register, because that way we get a beautiful balance so that the vocal folds can be nearly squared up and can vibrate like this. They oscillate constantly between what we call a divergent shape and a convergent shape. Divergent, convergent. And if you put them initially too much in this shape, then you cannot get that the divergent ever. And they try to oscillate like this, and that's not very helpful. Or if you squeeze too much with the thyroarytenoid muscle, then you get them too much adducted at the bottom, and they don't work very well. So you have to get a perfect balance between how much you bring the folds together at the top and how much at the bottom. And when you do that correctly, you have learned how to mix your registration, voix mixte or mixed register. And we all know that when we have a good, clean mixed register, then we have a wider pitch range and we can control our voice a lot better.
Yes. And that's when you're talking about all of this, we're talking a lot about what's happening within the muscles of the larynx and a lot of the lateral press that we might have. And we had a question about insights you might have on the implication of anterior posterior, so front to back constriction on the vocal folds in comparison to the lateral.
Yeah, that's a question I looked at and I'm not quite sure I understood. What do you mean front to back? Actually, along the length of the vocal fold, you have more adduction anterior and less posterior, or vice versa?
Well,
Anterior posterior pressure, maybe. Squeezing, yes. Anterior posterior squeezing.
Okay. Usually it's the lateral cricoarytenoid, the LCA, which brings the vocal processes together. And so if you have a lot of adduction posteriorly, then you may have too much LCA contraction. The TA, the thyroarytenoid muscle, brings the bottom of the vocal fold together, but it does that more anteriorly than it does posteriorly. And so those who have too much adduction anteriorly probably have too much TA contraction. Those have too much adduction posteriorly probably have too much LCA activity. And so it's a matter of learning how to balance these two together. And the nice thing is about the semi-occluded vocal tract techniques like straw phonation, it spreads the vocal folds apart at first by just the fact that you have pressure in there. And once you spread them apart, then you have better chance to play with the muscles and line them up so that they give you the best shape. If you're already stuck with being over-adducted at one point or the other, then there's not a whole lot of correction you can make.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. And by the way, to anyone who doesn't understand, the semi-occluded vocal tract is what we talked about, the straw exercise. And we have a question here about the mix, just to make sure people understand the meaning of a mixed voice. Do you mean mixing between the registers, or did you specifically mean mixing the muscle interaction and the activation?
Well, I'm talking about using the muscles in order to get the best configuration of the vocal folds around which they can vibrate easily and produce sound. So it involves Everything about the stiffness of the muscle fibers, everything about the stiffness of the ligament, and everything about how the vocal folds are shaped and positioned. All of that goes together in defining the mix or the mixed registration. And it doesn't even end there, because then you add on top of that, depending on which pitch you're doing, whether you're having your first harmonic or your second harmonic close to a resonance. And if that happens, then one harmonic will get reinforced more than another. And that can also change the perception of the sound and create kind of a acoustic register effect. When we talk about registers, I think it comes from organ playing. When we sit down at the console of the organ, we pull out a stop, and all of a sudden the sound suddenly changes to something very different. And people, I think, have used the term register to define that. There is a sudden perceptual change. But that can happen purely acoustically as formants and harmonics are interacting with each other. But it also can happen that you get a sudden change simply by the mechanics of the vocal fold. That's why registers are a very, very complex topic, because it involves really the subglottal system, the supraglottal system, and all the layers of the vocal fold. And there isn't just one simple answer for, you know, chest versus falsetto.
Yeah.
There's so much more when you try to get in between and kind of balance them out.
Yeah. So we're talking about muscles, and we're talking about acoustics, and basically we're just talking about the perception of smooth registration when we're saying a mix, right?
Right.
Message.
And in not every genre of music is that even the desired thing. When you listen to alpine yodeling or yodeling in Africa, the flipping of the voice is actually a desired thing. And same with Hawaiian music. It's in the opera world or the classical world where you like to keep the same timbre or the same voice quality in the voice throughout 2 octaves of pitch range or so. And when that is a requirement, then the registration becomes really an issue. But for much of the ethnic music that we hear around the world, nobody cares about registers. They just let it go wherever it goes.
Yeah. Yeah. Dan, Pnina, do you have anything else you wanted to say or add before we close?
I don't know. How do you say tanug in English? Pleasure?
Pleasure.
No.
Yeah,
Pleasure. Oh, it's a great pleasure. You know, it enlightens my all life and experience. You know, in these difficult days with everything around us, listening to you brings a lot of light and a lot of pleasure to us, to me, and to us, I think. It's a great pleasure to listen to you, but especially these days. And I appreciate so much that you could come and be with us. Yes. Great. We'll never forget it.
Thank you.
Come to Israel. You must come to Israel. Yeah. We'll promise you a good time. Yeah.
It's times like this when we have crises in the world where we who are in the singing world have it so good, because it's the singing and the emotional expression that lifts us up and helps us. And right. I grew up in, believe it or not, in World War II. I was a tiny little toddler, and my father and my parents went through the horror of the war, but always what picked them up was singing together and harmonizing together. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's what we can do. So thank you for your comment.
Yeah.
And we have another comment here that really enjoyed listening to all the wonderful knowledge that you have, and that you're charming. and Shahar actually had another question, only if it's okay, if you have time.
Sure.
I wanted to know what you think about voice types and classifications.
Voice types and classification.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I assume a tenor, baritone, that sort of.
Well, obviously we have the classification soprano, alto, tenor, bass. That's primarily comes from the choral setting, and it's kind of unfortunate that we have generated all our music in 4 parts mainly, because 6 parts would be much better, because most people are baritones and mezzo-sopranos and not so much tenors and basses and sopranos and altos. In fact, the concept of the alto has almost disappeared. And we as people grow up under the bell shape. So the most people are where most occurrences are sort of in the middle category, if you want to call it that. And that would be baritone for men and mezzo-soprano for women. But then the typing and the classification is so much driven by the industry. You know, certain people say, if I don't call myself a lyric soprano, I can't get a job, because there's so many more than there is for a contralto, for example. If you call yourself a contralto, you can sing the Messiah and that's about it, you're done. And so we're driven by industry, we're driven by our agents, we're driven by so many things to reclassify ourselves. And that sometimes is not the best thing. But it's wonderful for an amateur, because an amateur can decide anytime what they want to sing, and they can change the key. If the B flat's too high, you change it to an A flat, and you sing it anyway.
Yeah. Very true. Leslie's saying thank you for being an inspiration. Idan, did you want to add anything? Oh, we can hear you. Unmute. Do I need to unmute you?
No,
you're good.
Yeah, there we go.
Oh, I can hear now.
All right. Well, nothing too particular. I mean, I myself, as a singer and as a voice teacher, I'm trying to find the balance between I call it not micromanagement, but micro research of every single part of the system and how the formants interact with every harmonic and the various in the various styles. And I find that when I put on my hat as a singer, even when I'm just practicing at home, like a lot of that needs to go on autopilot. So I'm just wondering, maybe as a voice scientist and as a singer, obviously, if you have like, if there is like a takeaway that you can give singers, and by oversimplifying, I know this would be an oversimplification, by oversimplifying is like, if I need to keep in my head 1 or 2 or 3 technical principles while I'm singing, while I'm performing, like what will it be? What would they be? Because first ferment on first harmonic, say that's too complicated to process in real time. See what I mean? So I'm just wondering if there are any principles that sort of stick out that singers can, I guess, keep in their heads while they're doing it, or at least during practice.
Well, the good thing is that our body has a motor learning mechanism. And if we practice often enough, and we practice correctly and intelligently, that with the right mechanism, there comes a point when the body knows how to go there without you having to think about it anymore. So I think as a professional singer, you probably never even want to give any attention at all to your mechanism while you're producing it. I spent some time with George Shirley, who was an African-American tenor at the Met, and he said, I don't claim to know a piece until I have sung it at least 100 times or more. And he talked more like 200 times. And then, by then, all of the things that I practice are automatic now. They're part of the motor system. And then I only look at the audience, and I only look at my character and the interpretation I want to give. And if it doesn't come automatically, I don't worry about it at that moment. I go back later and fix it. But on stage, while you're performing, the mechanism has to be there, autonomic, so to speak.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, this is sort of the general truth that we keep telling ourselves, and it's good to be reminded of that a lot.
Yeah. We just
Right.
actually, we talked about it yesterday. I need to inject here something. Ingo, after you left yesterday, we talked about the subject of registers, um, and then we talked about what is a perceived register shift or not. And then I mentioned the lecture I did on the Beyonce voice, where I tried to imitate Beyonce, and I was really, as you say, done micromanaging some details there. And I did it, and there was what I sang in the beginning, and then the result that I worked on after adding some elements. And then when I tried to redo the lecture, I realized my body can't go back to the first result I did, to just the basic voice I had before I tried all the different elements and in imitating Beyonce and adding this twang or that vowel. My body just automatically learned and adapted into a new environment, all the neuromuscular thing that happened there. And I just couldn't go back. I could imitate something that is extreme just for the sake of, of showing what I wanted to work on, but I couldn't go back to what I did before. So just to kind of reinforce what you guys are saying is that our body is really an incredible machine and adapts all the time.
And what we don't yet fully understand, at least I don't understand, is why some motor activities are learned so quickly and why others take so long for any kind of adaptation to take place. We all know that once we have found out how to use our arms and legs to swim, it's a matter of seconds and we never forget it again. We also know how to ride a bicycle and we never forget it again. And that kind of motor learning is so rapid and so permanent. And yet other things we struggle with again and again and again, and we don't seem to match it up. And so I don't know why there's such a difference in the time period it takes to adapt something and to learn something. And it may have to do with just natural oscillations and natural resonance in the body. I believe that our system is made up of many, many oscillators that move back and forth. And sometimes they synchronize easily and they find the path, the beautiful path. And other times they just don't seem to want to synchronize. And it takes forever to change it. But if you know of any people who are studying this, how quickly you can learn a motor pattern and keep it as opposed to others that take so long, that would be a great a piece of knowledge to bring into our world.
Yeah. Beautiful. Idan, I felt like I cut you off earlier. Did you want to say anything else? No?
No. I have other probably more questions, but that's probably for a later time. That's okay.
Okay. Well, this has been wonderful, Ingo. I appreciate everything from just starting to learn with you and for coming here today. It's really just as Nina said, it means a lot to all of us, and to each of us personally, I think. Oria just said, thanks so much for great inspiration and value. Tammy said, thank you, Dr. Titze. She had a wonderful time. So yes, we're all really appreciated, and thank you.
Thank you.
And
best
regards to you, best regards to your wife.
Okay. Yeah. Well, she's still outside, I think.
Okay. Okay.
So keep on singing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Have a good evening or morning.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Goodbye, Dr. Titze. Thank you.
Bye-bye.